you see those potentially having any significance as part of, as it were, going back to that word, the platform, which I see is much broader than just software interfaces. And you've already mentioned legal issues with the action license. If you start to get into other questions about who participates in these things, what sorts of people are they, what do they share that isn't directly measurable by real measures. So it's a multi-part question. I think two main parts trying to address it right.
Well, so if I understand, then the two parts are one is the looking at especially grant vendor notion that is and the various kinds of issues that are involved other than communication, opportunism, and norms, and so forth. And the second was, I guess, what kind of
well, it's not going to be in this communication sort of
awareness.
It could be, yeah, as part of as a platform. The platform is not just specifying technical things. You know, so you mentioned legal, but there are other places you involve perhaps providing more of that structure, not the places that conversational questions.
Yeah, I think well, a couple of things come to mind. One is, I mean, I agree with you. There's definitely a whole rich set of things going on that we're not capturing that could be additional explanations. If I think about Greta Vedder and the context in which she wrote the paper, it really was in the context of traditional economic activity. Companies, organizations, profit incentives, we can fairly clearly define what opportunism means in those settings. And here, in some respects, this is perhaps a different paradigm. So it's not, which is part of that economic mystery, that this is not how this operates. And it may represent something that's quite fundamentally different from some of those factors. So in one respect, some of that either is maybe not relevant, or more than likely it shows up in different ways than it does in the way that Greta Vedder anticipated. But one of the things that comes to my mind immediately is the idea of open source as a movement and as a group of individuals who share some fairly strong values and norms. And so, for example, like in the case of closure, some of the reasons why closure is seen to be good is that these closed groups do tend to develop stronger norms and therefore have trust. So the whole notion of trust is related to closure. Well, in open source, you probably already, all of this is kind of embedded in an environment where there's already kind of this general agreement or general acceptance of the open source norm, and therefore there may be some underlying trust already among the community in general, the broader community, so that once people get involved in a particular project, maybe that's another reason why closure is not so important, is that you already have trust from these well-established norms. So that would be, one aspect to look at.
Just to clarify, define what you mean by what is meant by economic opportunism here, and has it ever been observed? Is it ever observed in open source projects?
Well, I guess economic opportunism would be taking unfair advantage of a position, acquiring resources that you don't have rights to have. Now, in the case of open source, there are rights. Nobody owns it in an economic sense, but there are very strong norms about who has the rights to it, who has the rights to make decisions. And typically, it's the founder who becomes the administrator who has the right to decide what does or does not go into the source code repository, and decide what direction the whole project is going. So yeah, there's another case where
Kind of power, but
it's a power, but it doesn't.
is that the economic opportunism that you're talking about?
Well, I can imagine. But here,
well, I mean, one answer is the opposite. It's right. If you've got opportunities, you have to stop the power. Flushing is not opportunity.
Oh, yes. Sounds like the administrator.
One way around the problem, as Grandmother says.
But I mean, But you mentioned things like cheating and so forth. What's to cheat?
Like in cheating, it might be forking. Okay, a fork happens when a group from one project decides to take the source code and go start another project. Well, it's absolutely legal. Nobody stops it, but there's a strong norm against it. And that's part of that right of the founder to make those kind of decisions. So that would be an example of opportunism, but not really economic. It's it has a different kind of opportunism. Right. So it does happen. It does happen.
It could be a power. I mean, to your point, it could be, he who is the founder is powerful, so therefore, steal someone's code and do it like you.
Yeah. Now, there is certainly between Richard, Stallman, there's a big power play. Now Nemec is a big asset. Yeah. Who gets credit against the other power? They don't necessarily own it, but they certainly want to credit the ego category.
So far, though, what stopped the important is the norms. Right. And so another way to sort of approach this might be, hey, it opens up a new set of research possibilities. But also, if you went back 5 years from now, 10 years from now, and did the same study, assuming source forge and open source still existed, would you necessarily get the same results? Because, after all, when you start talking about things like norms, you're talking about historically constructed economists, especially since there's no, again, solid force to really maintain right. And so, are we just looking at a moment in time, which is the movement of the ideas very nice analogy. We're looking at a moment in time in the history of software that may have, for example, highly motivated people, very committed to a set of principles and values, sharing very similar
The early stage of religion.
Early stage of religion. Exactly. That's around why.
They call themselves evangelists. They are evangelists, yes. Preaching the open source, yeah.
And as the Puritans done when they came to New England, it's easy to maintain that early, the first generation, they start to go their separate ways, and the second, you can't know what happened, but I mean, to the extent that some of this is constructed by the historic moment in which we're living, you might wonder if over time that is starting to break down.
Right, yeah. It might be easier to see something like that if you look at the Wikipedia.
The older?
No, because it has more opportunities.
There's more opportunity. Well, did I send you that?
Yes.
Correct.
For opportunities for power plays, for disagreement, for all of those things.
Political maneuvering.
There's all kinds of opportunities for that. Yeah.
I believe there was an article on Wikipedia recently that pointed out what a high percentage of the work is actually done by relatively small or
And even within that group, I've heard a lot of anecdotal stories about, and they're fighting with each other. So it's.
So a group that knows each other.
Oh, yeah. It's probably a university close to us, I don't know.
But I think the ability to get beyond those controversies and opportunism is a mark of a successful project. And I guess what you're saying is, will that continue? Maybe it will, maybe it won't.
Well, what the conditions are not simply the kind of traditional measures of structure. What are some of the others? And that, I think, helps to flesh out the platform from not just the technical interface is obviously sufficient, necessary sufficient, but it seems like the other parts of the platform is much more cultural.
Yes, and for example, I could definitely see part of the requirement for a good platform to be the control of opportunism and abuse. And we talked about that when we looked at creating platforms for open source of learning.
I would.
But at some point, we looked at, what would it take to create an open web repository of learning modules. And that was one of the requirements, is that we don't really call it a platform, we used to say template, but back then, we said, it needs